When you go through something like this and memories are blocked, it causes people in your life who are supposed to care and protect you to come up with their own stories. I want you to remember that nobody wants to make this up. Nobody wants this experience. You didn't deserve it. You're worthy of being protected. And I believe you.
Welcome back to Flip Your Mindset. I am your host, Stacey Urig, and my guest today is Jackie Robby. Jackie, am I saying your name right? Is it Robby or Roby?
It's Roby.
Roby. I'm glad I caught myself. That's the speech therapist in me. I'm like, I didn't say that right. So guys, I'm really excited to have Jackie here with us, and we're going to get into her story, but let me just tell you a little bit about her before we do. Jackie's the founder and CEO of Inspired Journey Consulting, and she uses the perfect harmony of positive intelligence, human design, and mental wellness practices while she helps individuals shine in their brilliance to amplify their authentic voice. But that didn't come easily for Jackie. Jackie's sharing with us today a story of abuse, a story of violence, and how she got through this experience and how she's using these gifts and the challenge, the purpose and the pain that she went through to help others. So welcome.
Thank you so much, Stacey. I'm grateful to be here.
Yeah, I'm so happy to have you here. I know you have a powerful story to tell, and I want to give you as much time as possible. So maybe you can just dive in and just share with us, what is the adversity that you experienced in your childhood?
So I first experienced abuse when I was 3 years old. My grandfather sexually molested me starting then for the next 4 years. I come from a Latin family. I grew up in New York. We had multiple generations living in one house. That was really common. And he was never stopped. It was one of those things that was pushed under the rug and forgotten so that we could continue to be a perfect family.
And do you feel that that resulted in you yourself being pushed under the rug and totally forgotten?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And were you trying to use your voice to share with people what was happening?
There was a point when I was 3 and I tried to say something and it was shut down. And from then on, I stayed quiet.
Yeah, because what I think people don't understand is the pain associated with being ignored. That level of betrayal is so extreme that there's a part of us that just decides to develop that says never again. Meaning, never again will I ever let her feel this disappointed, not just in what's happening with this abuse, but what's happening with the person that's supposed to be protecting me. Never again will I allow myself to see this. And so you went through this horrific experience from the ages of 3 to saying 7. You were saying for 4 years. And what happened after that point?
Eventually, we left, moved across the country. I don't know what the stopping point was. There's a lot that's been blocked.
Yeah.
And I thank my subconscious for protecting me. But it continued. I lost my voice, and it took up until I was 21 to get it back.
And I think it's interesting that you put it that way, because when we talk about these different parts that develop in benefit of us, that staying small and that losing your voice, again, is protecting you from any kind of betrayal or any kind of disappointment. If you don't say it, you can't be hurt, at least by, say, a parent, right? Who would be the person to defend, protect, what have you. So you lose your voice till you're 21. Obviously, we don't mean physically lose your voice. We're talking figuratively here. And it reminds me of another guest that I recently interviewed who also was being sexually molested and abused by a family member. And when she was very young, she went and told her mother. And her mother said, "You will not tell anyone, because if you tell, you will destroy this family. And now I'm not going to let you destroy this family." And the horrific part of that, obviously, is now they're making her the bad guy. Right? And at what point, she said, in that moment, I just realized I have no one I can go to. And her district, her school actually recognized the signs that something was happening and actually called protective services in to interview her at school. And she just said she just was mute. She just remained silent because all she could hear in her head was, if you tell, you're the problem. And this is the pervasive problem. There's so many issues with regards to abuse. But one of the pervasive issues is when you do try to use your voice, and then you're made into the person that's the problem, not the person that needs the support. So when I share that, how does that resonate with you?
I feel that so deeply, because those are the thoughts that go through your head. That's what went through my head.
Yeah.
And there are still times where that is the message. To be honest, if I think about the judge within me that beats me up, the message is, it's all my fault. And, we had the guidance that what happens in the family stays in the family.
Yeah.
It's our business, nobody else's. There was also, don't embarrass the family. And on top of that, I come from a police family. My grandfather was a policeman. My father was, my aunts, uncles. It was everywhere.
Wow.
And there was a lot of pride in that, and making sure that we were above par in
But
everything.
it's so interesting to me, the wielding of that kind of coercive control and that level of power, and the confusion it would cause for a young child of, you're supposed to be the person that's helping. You're the helper. You're in service of helping people, and yet you're not helping me. So you get to 21. You're already sharing one of the ways that it's negatively impacting you, this inability to have voice and choice, and this experience. You don't have a voice. How else was that impacting, do you think? Did you feel like it impacted the way that you were doing school? Did it impact your self-image? Because the reason why I'm asking is I want someone who's listening who maybe is going through the same experience to be able to connect in a way.
The first time that I started to pick my body apart, I was probably 4, and carpooling, sitting in the back seat and looking at my thighs. And very normally we sit and our thighs spread out. But I couldn't comprehend that, and I thought it was just me. And so I was intentional with how I sat to make sure that they were always elevated so they looked thin. They looked smaller. And that type of negative body image stayed with me and continued for years. It's something that I still recognize today, that when I feel out of control, I start to pick my body apart.
Mm.
And that's almost now a reminder to take a deep breath and give myself some love.
Yeah.
So it impacted how I saw myself. And then from there, romantic relationships.
Right.
I was always boy crazy, and I saw myself in that rom-com movie.
Mm-hmm.
But my behavior and the way I really felt, it wasn't even a leading lady. It wasn't the best friend. It was like an extra or somebody who tried out to be the extra and didn't get that role. That's how low I was. And so I found myself when I was 19 in a romantic relationship that ended up being abusive. And this one was mentally and emotionally abusive and isolating. And he was a rebound at the time.
Mm-hmm.
I had just been dumped. Um, I thought this was going to be casual. I thought it would make me feel good. And then all of a sudden, I'm with this person for a year and a half, and my world is smaller because I am catering to all of his needs, and his needs are saying, those people make me feel uncomfortable. This friend of yours doesn't make me feel,
Right.
your parents don't make me feel comfortable.
It's fascinating to me, and I'm so glad we're having this conversation because, and again, I try to use this platform to educate people through the story, right? So what I know to be true is these experiences that happen, these negative adverse experiences that we go through, if we're going through them before the age of 9 or 10 years old, the only thing a child can come up with is it must be me. If I'm being abused, it must be me. If I'm being molested, it must be me. If I'm being made fun of, if I'm being bullied, it must be me, because our rational brain is not developed. We're going based on feeling, and those feelings cause core beliefs. And we're so we're so ego focused at that moment because this is the part, this is where we're at developmentally. We can only come up with this. Add in, these people are police officers, these people are law enforcers. So I must be doing something wrong because they know better, right?
Exactly.
When these experiences happen, we talk about attachment to self and having a secure attachment to self and having a secure attachment to others as being where a lot of mental health positivity can reside. These experiences cause the bridge to ourselves to crumble a little bit. We start to see ourselves through this negative lens because, again, we think it's me. So if our interbridge is disrupted or ruptured, as they'll say, then that means the interbridge out. The intrabridge is also going to be destructive. And so what do? We're so afraid of abandonment. We're so afraid of betrayal. We're so afraid of rejection that we'll deprioritize what we want. We get small, we get quiet. And it was interesting to me that you said, I found myself in a situation where I was even smaller because our mind loves repetition. Our mind loves what's familiar. So if what was familiar was feeling small, even if it's not productive and it's not a good feeling, it's going to feel like home.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, being small in a weird way keeps you safe, even though you weren't safe in that situation. Does that make sense to you? Does that resonate?
Oh, absolutely. I think
Yeah,
about ways of trying to be invisible.
absolutely. And this is what I see when I'm working with my clients that come to me with a similar challenge, right? And it's keeping them so stuck, even though the event is 20, 30, 40 years down the road. And this is what I try to explain people. This is what trauma is. Trauma is not the event. I'm not saying what you went through was not traumatic. It absolutely was. But trauma is not the event. Trauma is the interpretation it caused you to have in that moment that created a negative self image, and it changed the way you saw yourself, your world, and others around you from a negative perspective. And then how unresolved that then leads to this thread of life in a way that you would not want to live it into adulthood.
Mhm.
Right? So, what happens at 21? Because you said you didn't have a voice till you were 21. So, what happens at 21?
So at 21, I had already broken up with this person. I finally recognized what I was going through. I had been volunteering with an organization called the Child Rescue Foundation. At the time, they were helping kids from families of domestic violence. So I had learned more of what I was in. I had gotten a restraining order against this person. I had ended up in court with him. I had had all of these experiences. But then after all of that was done, that kind of adrenaline of getting through, I had a moment, a reflective moment where I realized I was scared to date. And I wanted to make sure that I never found myself in this position again. So, how was I going to create change and realize where I came into play? How did I allow this to happen to me? What could I do differently? And where were the signs that I missed?
And I just want to ask you for the benefit of the listener, because you said something that's really poignant. And you said, how could I, what is it that you said? You said, how could I let this happen to me? And I just wanted to be really clear that we all know as a young child, you had no control over that situation. That wasn't something that you allowed to happen. I'm assuming, and I want you to clarify this, that when you say, how did I let this happen to me? It's the subsequent decisions, the relationships that you were finding yourself in, the having lost your voice by way of that experience. Because what I want people to understand is that the relationships that people find themselves in after they've been abused as a child often will mimic what it is that they were in. And it is so important to start to recognize patterns. People don't understand how we attract what's familiar and how we're drawn to what's familiar. And that we also have the ability to break those patterns. So, is that fair to say? Because I don't want you to be shaming yourself by saying, how did I let this happen to me at 3 years old? Were you referring to more of the decisions in your adult years?
Thank you for clarifying. Yes,
Okay,
I will
good.
tell you that in my teenage and adult years, that early stage, I had blocked out the memory of childhood abuse.
Interesting. So you were not connecting dots at that point.
Absolutely not.
Okay. Okay. I think that that's really important. So you're finding yourself with no voice, having a negative self body image, and finding yourself in destructive relationships, but not connecting dots because you don't have a memory of the abuse at the time.
Exactly.
Okay. really good for people to understand, because I think that that's really common.
Mm-hmm.
And I want people to understand that if they're listening to this and this is where they're at, it's not that uncommon. Okay, so you go through this experience, you've found a voice, you've taken this person to court, you've gotten a restraining order. Where do you start to connect the dots of early childhood experiences and where things were leading for you?
Mm. I have to say that it took more time. I had went to counseling at a place called Safe House Denver. I learned about red flags and boundaries, and I'd never heard the word boundary before. So all of that was really helpful. And then that same year, within a matter of months, I find myself sitting with my grandfather, and he's making lunch for me, and he says, I've got to show you something. And he takes out his wallet, and in his wallet is a picture of me from when I was 12. And he says, I carry this with me all the time. And I still wasn't connecting. And I said, oh, I have newer, better pictures. Like it didn't make sense to me. Then we sit on the couch, and my family is very affectionate. And so we were sitting right next to each other. And I didn't feel comfortable with that, but I was blaming myself, thinking, well, I had just come through this abuse. I have just been through all of this counseling around red flags. I'm being overly sensitive.
Mm,
And we're sitting there, and he starts to kind of rub my ear, kind of caress my ear. And I felt uncomfortable, but I didn't say anything. And then he takes my hand and he starts to rub my hand. And I feel uncomfortable, but I don't say anything. And then he takes my finger and puts it in his mouth. And I freeze. And I don't know how and I don't know when, but I got out of there and I drove to see my parents and I told them what happened. And the first thing they said was, well, had he been drinking? And I said, no, and it doesn't matter.
right.
And then there were shared experiences of how he made other people feel uncomfortable, including my mother. And then we saw him for dinner that night, and it was never brought up again.
Dysfunction 101.
And then 5 years later, I had already moved across the country. I was coming back to visit for the holiday for Christmas, and he said, come to my office. I want to show you something. Okay. So I go into his office a little begrudgingly, and he shows me that the desktop image on his computer is me. And it was a picture that my aunt had taken of me a few months before. And I was taken back and weirded out, but I didn't know what to say. And he said, oh, I think about you all the time. And, I'm raised to be polite. I said, oh, I think about you too. And he says, I miss you. I said, I miss you too. He said, I think about that time when you were 3 years old. You were laying on the floor, sleeping, waiting for me to come home. And you were wearing these gray cotton panties. And it took everything in me not to take them off of you. And I froze. And my younger cousin came in. My sister had sent her in. She said, Tina wants to see you. And my sister said, I don't know, something felt off.
Mm.
And I told her about it. And she said, you will never be alone with him again. And that within a few weeks started to kind of spiral into my first experience with depression.
Mm.
And this is where it all started to connect.
What kind of work did you do to start to connect those dots?
Therapy. Therapy was the first step for me. I remember Christmas Eve being home, being tipsy, laying in bed, thinking if my heart stopped, nobody would care. And I'm not sure I would either.
Mm.
And I knew I needed help. So I started in therapy. I should have taken the advice of medication sooner than I did because it spiraled. I found myself with such extreme CPTSD.
Yeah.
Those symptoms coming out and not knowing how to function.
What were those symptoms for you? Because I really think it's important that the listener understand what some of the symptoms are for complex PTSD.
Yeah. So I had paranoia, extreme paranoia. I would walk down the street and I was convinced people were looking at me, glaring at me, thinking horrible thoughts about me.
Mm.
And they would flip from one side to the other. It was either about my weight, thinking she's too big to wear this. What is she thinking? Or if it wasn't my weight, it was then who I was and thinking she's such a slut.
And had you experienced those kinds of thoughts prior? At that level, like to a paranoia level?
No.
Right.
No, never.
Right. And that must have left you feeling what?
I was terrified. I remember just trying to speed walk those 2 blocks to get to my office. But then I was also scared at work. I thought that I was that they were trying to fire me. I thought people were reading my emails. I couldn't go a few hours without a panic attack.
Yeah. And I can share from my seat what I understand what was going on, but I'd love to hear from you. I know in the moment you did not understand what was happening, but what have you learned since that time of why that was coming up for you or what was happening?
Mm. So it was confusing for quite some time, to be honest, because I was told it was more about depression and anxiety. And CPTSD was thrown in there, but it was buried under all these other pieces.
Mm-hmm.
And I had spent so long running from my feelings that when they caught up to me, it was debilitating.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important for people to understand a few things. Number one, we have 4 innate ways to react to threat, stress, alarm, right? So we know about fight or flight. We hear about that all the time. We hear about our body being engaged in a fight or flight response. And fight or flight are 2 of the 4, right? So when we're in a chronic, prolonged state of stress, or even an acute state of stress, the part of our brain that gets triggered is the amygdala. And that's kind of like, command center 911. And our initial kind of innate response is to either fight it out or flee. But when you're 3, or when you're 8, or when you're 10, fighting or fleeing may not be an option, especially when you're dealing with an adult, right? So then what are our next options? We can fawn our way out of it. So fawning is, how do I make you like me so this will stop? People pleasing, perfectionism, deprioritizing your own needs, not setting boundaries. But if we're not really fully verbal, that's not going to be something that we're going to really know how to do, right? And if we're trying to set boundaries and that's not allowed in our household, whether it's cultural or not, if it doesn't work, you're going to go for the next response option, which is freeze. And freeze looks like complete shutdown. It also looks like disassociation. How do I fully disconnect myself from my body in order to make it through this experience? It is a brilliant thing that our mind allows us to do, because our mind and our body have one job and one job only: to keep you alive. And if this threat feels so overwhelming, if the emotions that are happening are so overwhelming, which in your case could have been above and beyond fear and sadness, massive confusion, right? The only thing it can do is shut down. And the only thing you can do is disconnect from these very big, very bold, very intense feelings, because we're feeling machines between the ages of 0 and 10. Everything's a feeling. And everything we decide about ourselves is based on that feeling. And every coping strategy and lived behavior we come up with is based on that feeling. Now, when you were talking about being very hypervigilant about people looking at you going to work and what are they thinking, and what I'm and at work, who's checking my email, what I see there is this deep recognition of kind of being connected back, not as disassociated. You're starting to connect the dots. And now this old sensation in the system, which is built into the hippocampus of our brain, which has no time bound whatsoever, is safety is not available to me. That would have been a very potential core belief that a child would have experienced in that type of situation. Safety is not available to me, and this is happening to me because I'm not worth anything. I'm not worth much, because that's why this is happening to me. Because I'm not useful. I'm not enough. I'm discardable, right? These are the things that a young child will likely decide as a way to survive it. So, when we're working and we talk about things like CPTSD, again, for somebody that doesn't know what that is, it's complex PTSD. And it's very often associated with not an acute situation, but a large series of prolonged chronic adverse experiences, prolonged chronic stress that cause you to cope in a way to survive it and keep you hindered later on in life. Right? So here it's almost like the box was locked. And then once you unlock that box, every normal feeling you would have had in that experience is now coming to you like a gusher. Does that resonate with you?
Wow. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So what I'd love to do is kind of just stop right here and pause. You've shared this intense experience with us. What I really want to hear from you in our next episode is, how did you go from surviving to thriving? Because I know you found that bridge. So what I'd love to do is end the episode here. Be so grateful. I mean, I am so honored and so grateful for your courage to share such an intense experience in such a beautiful way. I could feel the emotion, I could see the emotion. And I think the listener could feel that emotion as well. And I really would love to invite the listeners to take part in our second episode together, which is really where we're going to talk about going from what happened to what's next. So if you guys have enjoyed this episode, I'm going to ask you to look in the show notes for the link to the next episode that I'm going to have with Jackie, where she's going to really talk to us about what her healing journey was and how that brought her to being the inspiring consultant, coach, speaker that she is today. So, Jackie, is there anything you want to leave us with for this particular episode?
Absolutely. It's something that you mentioned at the very beginning, and I'd love to bring a little bit full circle. One of the most damaging and heartbreaking pieces of this experience that lingered was not being believed and not being protected. And when you go through something like this and memories are blocked, it causes people in your life who are supposed to care and protect you to come up with their own stories. I spent 15 consecutive years in therapy. Over time, I had 4 or 5 different therapists, all wonderful, all for different reasons in my life. But I would replay the story with each of them because there was a part of me that was listening to the people who doubted me and having that fear that, what if this wasn't real? And having the confirmation from all of them that it was. I want you to remember that nobody wants to make this up. Nobody wants this experience. And you didn't deserve it. You're worthy of being protected.
Mm.
And I believe you.
Very powerful. And I think it really is what people need to hear who have gone through this, who maybe, like you, suspect that they've blocked something out. And, I love the fact that you make yourself available and you've created a safe place for somebody to come and say, I think it's maybe me too. So, for people that are resonating with Jackie's story, for people that feel connected to her and her experience, I encourage you to reach out to her. She has a consultation she can offer, she has sessions that she can offer. All of that information is very easily accessible right in the show notes. And I'm just so grateful to have you here. And I'm so excited to bring episode number 2 to people so they can hear how you've gone from, again, that surviving to thriving. So thank you so much.